Hello, everyone. In this session, we are going to talk about our psychological response to climate or eco-anxiety. Generally, we use this term, eco-anxiety or climate anxiety alternatively. So why this topic is important and why it has become over the years much more relevant for us. We all know that in the recent years, the fear of climate change, it has threatened our core understanding of the vulnerabilities of our social systems, our physical systems, and our structures that we are aware of, or our local ways of knowing or predicting things. Therefore, it's not just the life itself that climate change has threatened, but also everything that is social, everything that is communal, everything that is important for our individual well-being that has been at stake. Therefore, it is important to talk about what climate anxiety is and how our response as individuals, as psychologists, as climate activists has been impacted by climate-related changes and also the anxiety that is being provoked constantly because of that. So we all know that the potential ontological security that is under threat, and as we know that Norgard and many other researchers have constantly talked about how over time, when our environment is going to be more unstable, we are going to be more worried and constantly anxious about climate anxiety. And as psychologists of contemporary times, I think it is important that we give due weightage to this issue and talk about it as much as we can. In addition to that, we know, and recent research coming from environmental psychology also indicates to this, that now more than ever before, we need to incorporate issues of climate anxiety into our general debates and into our understanding of the local and the global world that exists around us, so that we can provide better care to individuals, to our communities, and everyone that is being impacted by climate change directly or indirectly. So let's start with the lecture for today. So let me share my screen with you. Yes. Okay, so earlier we discussed what are the key issues that research has indicated for us when it comes to research on climate change and the anxiety that is related to climate change. So now let's directly delve into some of the additional things that we need to know about climate anxiety, and also what is our psychological response to climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, and how as students or as learners in the field of climate psychology and generally sustainability, how can we support our communities in a better way? So let's start right away with when it comes to climate anxiety, it is generally associated with perceptions about climate change, and even among people who are not directly impacted by climate change. And I think it's really important to differentiate that for a very long time, we might have thought that many of the associations or influences of different psychological issues or phenomena, they were very localized or they were very direct. But more and more we have exposure to social media and different platforms, for example, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We have a lot of influx of digital footprint, which kind of also associates distant anxieties. So when it comes to psychological distance, even if we are not directly experiencing the different impacts of climate change, indirectly, much of it also reaches us. And again, I think, as I said earlier, it is important to know about these issues, to have some kind of indirect contact with these contents. But also we need to understand that there have to be positions that are to be taken when it comes to people's vulnerabilities. Different groups, as we will be discussing in this lecture later on, we know that different groups have different vulnerabilities, and then depending upon their vulnerabilities, we also need to provide them kind of support that is needed. And sometimes it might also mean that these people need to take some break from different social media footage that is prevailing. Also, many times, as we know, that people do not give content warnings, which might be very distress for people. So for example, in this course, when we talk about climate change and climate related impacts or climate anxiety, we know that we are learning some of these contents for better understanding, but someone who might end up in these contents without any previous knowledge or warning, they might feel more distressed than audience who are genuinely interested in understanding or learning about this topic. We now know that popular media now are full of stories, footage about climate anxiety, eco-anxiety, and climate grief, to the extent that climate anxiety is now they also called the biggest pop culture trend. And I think this is something that all of us can agree to and we have experienced. So for example, when the town of Lytton was on fire, there was 24-hour live streaming happening on our television, on YouTube channels, and many other places. So sometimes, of course, like, it's anxiety. It could also be something that is directly or indirectly related to us. But there is a lot of media overload too. So people need to understand that sometimes people might generally end up in places watching these contents where they might not be like, fit for, or someone might be way too younger for these contents. So it's important that when we are sharing such contents, especially live footage or videos, it's important that we give these disclaimers when it comes to creating or propagating climate anxiety. So we know that the range of sufferers, of people who are suffering because of climate anxiety, it is constantly growing. That's why I think it is a very important topic for you as young psychologist going forward, when you are going to talk about issues of recent times, and particularly the modern clinical psychology, which is very much embedded in climate-related impacts. So it is really vital that the reach of these communication technology is known to us, so that we can provide better care to people who are around us, our communities, and even ourselves. So the psychology of climate anxiety and how to work with it in order to do well with the understanding and to provide better care doesn't matter that it's only going to be the clinical one, but also generally too. I think it is very important that we understand it is already one of the top threats to human well-being, but also over time it is going to become a larger threat. And as we know that Ursano and colleague in 2018, they described that climate change, it is going to be one of our top threats, and hence also one of the top anxiety-provoking construct for the 21st century. So it's great that APA at least has started doing a great job since 2010. So almost a decade ago, we already started seeing these climate change and climate sustainability related reports coming out of APA. So when APA talks about better understanding of climate change related impacts, and particularly climate anxiety and working with this eco-anxiety, it provides a generic framework for better understanding of what are the factors that play out and how they impact us. So specifically, they talk about these 6 factors. First one is understanding what is our own perception of risk, and especially, like, sometimes people might be more vulnerable, and their perception of risk might be underreported, or the other way around. Sometimes they might not be at as much risk as others, but just because now they have more exposure to social media and other narrative building, they might be much more stressed out about these issues. The second issue is about psychological and behavioral causes of climate change. And I think here psychology does a great job compared to many other social sciences in understanding and delineating climate change as more of an issue which is related to anthropogenic causes. And that's why I think how our own behavior and how the impacts of our own behavior that are translating into climate change, how to talk about these narratives and how to understand them better. I think it is really a big pillar of climate psychology, sustainability psychology, to think about the behavioral causes of climate change. And again, we are doing something similar in this course to talk about the behavior that are more sustainable and how to stretch them towards better sustainability and to attain better sense of purpose and meaning. The third component that American Psychological Association's 2010 report has extensively talked about, it is specifically about the issue of eco-anxiety, which means that the psychological impact these climate changes, which are again based on many of our behavior, be it like, we humans as industrialists, as global leaders, or in whatever capacity, but nonetheless, these psychological impacts are based on our own behavior. So how to tackle and understand that eco-anxiety better, I think APA's report has done a wonderful job on that. Then also, what are the psychological adaptation and the coping strategies? So of course, if we understand what eco-anxiety is, only then we are going to be able to develop better coping strategies, not only for climate anxiety, but also how to engage in adaptation, how to change our own individual and our social and community behavior in order to go to that end goal of making this world more sustainable place, even if our role in that is going to be small, but nonetheless, it's purposeful and it's meaningful. Then I think we have extensively talked about the psychological barriers to action and also to inaction. So as we have discussed in our previous lectures, that we have been constantly given this impression that as if our individual behavior is the only one that is the barrier to sustainability, which is not true. And I think we have heavily debated on that issue, but nonetheless, it's important to know that sometimes when we become complicit consumers, or we tend to also dismiss important information that comes our way. So how to engage with that information in a better way without becoming victim to eco-anxiety. So these things are really important and discussed at detail in this report. And lastly, the vital role that psychologists can play and they must play now and in the coming times, when we have to have large-scale debates about climate anxiety and also about improving the well-being of our people. So then the role of climate anxiety in climate psychology, it has over the years become quite important. And as we know that the Climate Psychology Handbook that was launched in 2020, it defines climate anxiety as a heightened emotional, mental, or somatic stress in response to dangerous changes in the climate system. Now, you might wonder that this might also be similar to the anxiety definition of any other anxiety disorder. But here we need to see that, well, many people might have a whole different range or variety of anxiety-related disorders. But when it comes to eco-anxiety, the main trigger or the major trigger for those people have to be climate system or the changes in climate system. So we can't generically, like, call everything that it is related to eco-anxiety. And sometimes people, if they don't understand the construct very well, they might also misassociate it. If they are, let's say, stressed out about something else, they might be associating it with the climate related changes. So if someone has seasonal or vulnerabilities or related anxieties, they might also associate it with climate anxiety. So it is important to differentiate these two constructs. So whenever the main cause or these the danger or the alarm is more closely linked, directly embedded in the changes in our climate system, only then we associate it with climate anxiety. Therefore, also this handbook argues that we need to pay much more attention to climate anxiety, and only if we understand it better, we will be able to be more prepared for the healthier responses. And sometimes, people might have to tune in, and sometimes they might have to tune out of these climate-related hazards and climate-related difficulties or anxieties that they might face. Similarly, in addition to this handbook of climate psychology that came out in 2020, American Psychological Association has also in the past talked to eco-anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom, which ranges from mild stress to clinical disorders like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide. And all of that indicates the maladaptive coping strategies too. So how do we provide support to these people to develop better coping strategies? We are going to talk about it in a little bit, but also more recent research, especially by Sian Coney et al. In 2020, it has also found that climate anxiety, it's not just like, certain fears, certain depression, or certain perceived vulnerability and anxiety. It can also be a rather complex set of variables that plays into producing or making this anxiety more profound. So complex types of climate anxiety, they can and they are associated, they can trigger, and they are also associated with generating high levels of trauma. And sometimes it can also be intergenerational, particularly when we talk about the role of climate change in migration and creating more refugees around the globe. So in that sense, when one generation moves from one place to another, it also translates into a lot of intergenerational negative affect and intergenerational trauma. And similarly, when the environmental damage involves loss of people's life and their culture, and that usually happens when either people have lost their land, when they have lost their livelihoods, or when they have left the places where they were more familiar with the climate, when they were more familiar with the social structures and the community, and their mobility in those places was very well known to them. So the local knowledge where they were better adapted, where their operational life was more sustainable. So in that sense, it's not a very straightforward assessment that someone has eco-anxiety or not, but it can also be a range of complex types of climate-related trauma, anxiety, depression, PTSD, and reoccurring trauma. So particularly people who become refugees, and if they are moved from one country to another, in those periods and in those prolonged cycles of migration, or in those limbo of waiting, these people, they have much stronger impacts of climate change that translates into intergenerational trauma as well. So as I said earlier, when we think about climate anxiety, we can't specifically say that, okay, these are the symptoms and these are probably like, less related symptoms. There can be a set of symptoms. So as psychologists, for us, it's important if we want to provide more specific psychological support to understand, we need to understand what is the range of symptoms that can be associated with climate anxiety. And as I said earlier, not all anxieties they are associated with climate or eco-anxiety. So only if the trigger factor is climate change or the constant worry about the changes that are happening in our immediate or in our extended global climate. If people are experiencing panic attacks because of that, if people feel that there is a constant sense of weakness, and that weakness can be psychological or also physical, but particularly the one that is psychological, where people feel that there is no control over their environment. That takes us back to self-determination theory, where people feel that they are no more competent about operating in their physical environment, or when they feel that there is no autonomy, they have no control over their immediate environment. And also sometimes when their relatedness is shattered. So all of that contributes or associates with this kind of weakness. When people are constantly worried, they are not only panicking, but there is a constant sense of irritability. Just because, as I said earlier, if there is no autonomy, there is no control, or that perception of control is lost, that creates higher levels of irritability for people. And of course, there are also symptoms related to sleeplessness and loss of appetite. As I discussed earlier, we have seen such impacts happening more often in places where climate has radically changed already. And we have also seen much of this happening in Australia. There has been a lot of research coming out of Australia from climate psychology, sustainability psychology, and environmental psychology, indicating that masses in the population, they now face severe symptoms of climate-related anxiety. So climate anxiety is being felt, of course, much more often. It's being felt much more powerfully in our communities, but it's not that linear. The onset of this kind of anxiety, we are seeing that more of this is happening in younger people. And again, it's also related to the direct natural disasters in the communities, but globally we see that a younger people who are our youth, or people who are more sensitive about the global climate, and people who think that their future is the one that is going to be more radically impacted by climate change. So those people, they have much stronger symptoms, or they show much higher onset of climate-related anxiety. So it's important that we understand people who are climate scientists, people who are activists, people who are youth who are interested in knowing and learning about their climate, and youth who are sensitive, people who are themselves engaging in actions that are trying to protect this planet. So when they see that there is this lack of control or autonomy, there is this lack of willingness from the global leaders, or older people who might have more power in the social setups or in the communities, if they are not doing enough, that can actually have much more stronger impact on our younger lot. So I think it is important that we understand the scale of eco-anxiety, and also how can we offer ourselves to help our younger people who are being more impacted by eco-anxiety or climate-related anxieties. Then it's also important that it's the climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, it's more pronounced and it's more profound into communities where they have more dependence on others, or people who are already included in at-risk populations. So for example, if we talk about people who are pregnant, people who are less abled, or people who have, let's say, chronic illnesses, they are already much more vulnerable. And when they think about, like, how future holds much more either destruction or climate-related changes around them, this provokes a lot more eco-anxiety in these population. In addition to that, we have seen that people who have less control over their immediate climate, for example, people who are poor in the low socioeconomic status of their communities, or people who have already been displaced or who are at the verge of being displaced. And we have talked already about evictions and how evictions, they make people disproportionately vulnerable. In addition to that, people who are migrant, people who are refugees, who have been pushed away from their local environment that was known to them. For them, climate anxiety can be causing multiple vulnerabilities, which increases or exacerbates their eco-anxiety. In addition to that, people who are elderly, who have seen better times. So remember, in the previous lecture, we were talking about eco-nostalgia. So if they have seen better times, according to them, they feel more anxious what the future is holding for the younger generations. And for younger generations, when they are at a point when they understand how quickly our climate is changing, of course, they also show higher levels of distress and higher levels of eco-anxiety. In a similar way, people who are used to getting training and they are used to, like, working in more intensive energy environments, for them also the impact of climate change, they are causing much more anxiety. And many times people from the lower socioeconomic strata, they are the ones who work mostly in manual labor as manual workers, or people who work outdoors, for example, in construction industries and many other places where we have a large scale workforce that is engaged in manual labor. For them also, the impacts of climate change, they can be much more anxiety provoking, because they immediately see the impacts or the changes in the climate, compared to many of us who are studying, working, or engaging in the livelihoods that are not directly in the sun, or that are not directly under the water, or they are not literally, like, outside, happening into the much drastically changing environment. So in that sense, I think when we think about eco-anxiety or providing support, we also need to make categories to make sure that we are not just putting everyone at the same pedestal. Of course, everyone needs help, but people who need more help, or people who are more concerned about the ecological changes, they should be prioritized such that they can be given more support. So in future, or currently, whenever you have people who fall into these risk populations and who are around you, or them personally, directly, indirectly, reach out to them for support, because many times people who are most vulnerable, they might not even have the terminologies for expressing the kind of eco-anxiety that they are experiencing. Which brings me to the next point, that the role of psychologists in eco-anxiety, in the management, in the understanding of eco-anxiety, is extremely important. One of the papers for this week by Clayton, 2020, it clearly talks about the heightened levels of anxiety, fatalism, or hopelessness and fear that is increasing across the globe, and particularly in the nations where people have higher levels of literacy, where people have clinical support available to them. So these kinds of understanding that should become a norm now, that if people reach out for reporting eco-anxiety, they should have better mechanisms or support mechanisms available to them for measuring and treating climate anxiety. We also know that our psychologists, of course, they are very well equipped, particularly clinical psychologists, when it comes to providing support for anxiety, for distress, or for any kind of climate-related traumas. But I think after what we have seen in Lytton, or what just happened in Merritt just a day ago, that the whole town was flooded and everyone had to be evacuated because there was no drinkable water. So all of these events, they indicate to a point that it's not only going to be like, the physical evacuation of people from these climate related changes, or from these like, disastrous events that are happening around us, but also we need to get our people mentally or psychologically out of these traumas as well. So our psychologists, they really need to work with lots of people who might be in trauma or in despair or going through a lot of emotional or ecological impacts because of these events that are happening around us. Also, Susan Clayton's work emphasizes on the distinction between adaptive and maladaptive types. So we can't always say that eco-anxiety is completely adaptive or maladaptive. As I said earlier, we need to encourage the society level response, which is required in order to combat climate change. But also we need to understand that if we do not sensitize our people enough, we might not gather that social or that community-based response that is needed to mitigate or adapt for climate changes. But also we need to know that when it is enough, how much like trauma footage has to be shown to us on TV, and particularly when it comes to already marginalized communities within our populations, we need to do a much better job in order to provide more nuanced media coverage, so that people are not just distressed for no reason. So we need to talk about this eco-anxiety, but also we need to provide tools to people in order to de-stress them, so that they feel that there is some autonomy. This is something in which they can do they can make changes, or they can actually make a change in their lifestyle, in their micro behaviors or macro behaviors, so that we can adapt to climate change. So anxiety can be maladaptive, but also it has an adaptive component to that, and we also need to capitalize on that component as psychologists. So why don't we act if we already know that eco-anxiety is happening? We already know that it has a large-scale impact on our communities. Then why aren't we just literally getting into it and trying to tease apart what is the good level of anxiety that we need in order to make climate adaptations or mitigations? So what are the barriers? What are the things that are actually stopping us? So we have seen that Dodd's work that just came this year, and this work is really fascinating because it compares climate change or eco-anxiety and the effects of ecological changes in the perspective of COVID-19 too. So we see that climate as a larger disaster, it's happening globally and it is impacting our communities. So Dodds does a great job in comparing how climate change is also kind of making people much more anxious, and how many of these impacts are also comparable with what's happening on the level of this pandemic. So we know that there is restriction, or there is very reduced collective response to climate change, and it's in very stark contestation with the threat it is causing. And there are multiple reasons that researchers, psychologists have provided over the years to talk about what is it that literally impacting or hindering our choices to act. So in that sense, Dodds talks about these four hypotheses. And these are the reasons that why we are not acting on stopping the climate changes, but also kind of prevailing more and more eco-anxiety as a direct outcome of that. So the first thing, hypothesis is called faulty alarm hypothesis, which is associated with the cognitive bias in our evolved risk detection system. And you would remember from what we had talked about previously, when we said that we are constantly being told that actually humans are not well adapted for the cognitive biases, and we are actually because of our not so good detection system in our mind, we are actually the one who are being mostly impacted because of these climate changes, which are then translating into different types of risks, and particularly the ecological anxiety too. And also this faulty alarm hypothesis, it basically offers us an explanation that suggests that humans have evolved the ability to respond to certain types of threats optimally, and particularly the ones that are directly in front of us, where we are not psychologically distant from them, and especially the ones that are immediate, that are visible, that are fast. However, historically, if things are far in the future, and the historical precedent, for example, if there is no causality that we can directly see, it's harder for people to act on those issues. So in that sense, psychologically, many researchers find that it's probably that lack of risk detection system in our minds, because of which we are not able to basically talk about or act on these systems. And if we are not acting, of course, we are facing a sense of loss of control. And that sense of loss of control is also the one that is translating into climate-related inaction and also heightened anxiety. So if you're not doing something about climate-related changes, it also then means that our levels of anxiety, they are also going to be much bigger, much large scale. In a similar way, we know that from this perspective, the problem with climate change is that we do not feel enough learning opportunities, but again, that does not undermine any of the anxiety that is the result of this inaction. So this inaction is translating into higher levels of anxiety over time. Also, we need to understand that in order to get our way out of this anxiety, we need to stay motivated. And again, some of this anxiety can be good because that can help us in being engaged towards climate mitigation and adaptation. But many times that might not be our option, because if people are just so stressed out because of the inaction and because of the degrading climate, it might continue to be much more difficult. In a similar way, the second issue is about the social dilemma as a bystander effect. So this is really interesting because we all know that social dilemma, or also previously we have discussed the dilemma of commons, or the commons dilemma. It involves conflict between individual and collective self-interest. So if people are constantly thinking about maximizing their own interest, then of course it's going to undermine our collective world. And especially, let's say, if we are engaged in making changes to our behavior and trying really hard to make adaptations and make changes to our lifestyle in order to make sure that the future, or the future of our climate, is better. And still, if we see people who are not acting on these goals, and who are rather just focused on, like, maximizing their own profits, then it's really disheartening. So I think many times when people feel that there are large scale mining industries, there are large large-scale political or social infrastructures that are actually not serving our communities, and they are putting us at a larger risk. That also creates, as people who have some power on our own individual behavior, but we can't, our behaviors would add up, but the large scale changes, we still don't have that much control on that. And then being there as a bystander, I think people feel a lot more stress and anxiety. So in that sense, I think that political activism, engaging and talking about climate and trying to push the boundaries of the political systems, where we really need to talk about why we are suffering, and why it is so much more important for our local and our national and our global leaders to act on it and act now. So that social dilemma, we constantly compare, we constantly see, but that anxiety is also kind of needed for our climate action, for our own concerns, and for raising our voice for those concerns. One thing I also want to highlight over here when it comes to the faulty alarm hypothesis, or when it comes to a social dilemma, a bystander effect, we have seen that in the recent last 18 months, or in last 2 years since the onset of the pandemic, we have seen that the social fabric and the understanding of how our communities work, and how in many ways our vulnerabilities have become so naked. It's really because of our understanding and our detection of what's going wrong and what we immediately need to do in order to get out of this pandemic. So for example, we were immediately in many places, at least in the world, we were put into lockdowns. We were asked to stay in our own communities, in our own countries. We were not supposed to travel. Then for a very long time we continued to wear masks, and till today we are wearing masks. And when we saw that, okay, so this is where these problems are, and we immediately moved forward and we took action. But the problem is, because we were so much under the threat, we were literally losing many lives right in front of our eyes because of the COVID-19. So immediately many things were in effect, right? But the problem with climate change is because many of the things still we have to predict for future. So latent happened, or marriage just happened, but that's still not enough probably for people to think about the impact or the scale of climate change. So still, we had COP26, all the global leaders, well, most of them, they were there, but still the willingness that was really not at a level where it should have been. So probably when we have another major, let's say, summit in 10 years, in 20 years, when probably many more impacts of such climate changes will be more visible, probably people will take large scale actions then, if not now. Then if we talk about the eco-psychology, the problem of disconnection from nature, I think this is a really important one. Whenever we think about past generations, or there is also eco-nostalgia that is in play over here, which creates a lot of anxiety in people. So for example, let's say since 1990s, we have seen a lot of research on eco-psychology that has emerged as a particular response within psychology to environmental problems, which emphasizes the holistic approach, which suggests that the modern lives, they are just too disconnected from the nature. And just that disconnection from the nature is the one that is causing a lot more anxiety, because if people are exposed to more nature. Also in the next lecture, we are going to discuss about how our exposure to nature is actually one of the best intervention for us to reduce our levels of anxiety. In vicarious modalities or in the live modalities, we have seen that again and again in research. So this the eco psychology, or the problem of disconnection from nature, it's one of the major things that's causing this eco anxiety. And I think now we will also discuss later on in some of the interventions. We have seen that people are more and more being tuned into how to connect with nature more often and in a better way, so that we are also sensitive towards our climate, and we feel that stronger power and connection with the nature, which is important for our activism, but also it is vital component in reducing our ecological anxiety or our climate related anxiety. And again, it's really interesting. When we think about the COVID-19 comparison, we have seen that because then we were not just sitting on planes and flying for thousands of miles, and we tried to find out the natural places around our communities, and people actually felt lower anxiety. Of course, they were still missing their social connections and their bonds, but their anxiety was lower when they were exploring the nature that was immediately around them. So we have seen that it had two types of impacts. Of course, our 2020 global emissions, they were dropped from a higher levels to lower level, and again the global temperatures, they had a bit of fall too, because of the lower levels of emission. So in that sense, I think those I'm not saying that we need to completely restrict ourselves, but whenever possible, exploring the local ecological spaces, that might be a better alternative for our well-being, and also being lighter on our climate. And lastly, one of the major hypotheses that has been proposed in psychology, it's about psychoanalysis, which is a climate denial and apathy as a defense anxiety, as a defense against anxiety. And again, this is something that we have experienced a lot, that just like COVID-19, though it's there, it's in our face, but still there are many people who would tell you that, well, COVID is not real, or this is just a made up virus, or all those conspiracy theories that come with that. In a similar way, when it comes to climate anxiety, many people do not want to engage, not because they don't care, it's just their defense mechanism, through which they can actually just tell others that, well, it doesn't exist. If you are in such a stark denial, then you don't have to engage with that anxiety in any way. So of course, you are saved from all the compassion that you have to show for nature. You have these big industrialists who would often deny that climate change is real, just because if they accept it, then they will be questioned, and they will be asked to make changes in their industries and in their behavior. So that apathy or that denial, it actually serves some of these people, and especially people with a lot of money, in a better way. So again, people like Elon Musk, or I'm sorry saying the names, or people who work for the Amazon, and in all of these ways, when people do not have alternates, better alternates, who are working in or for these industries, an easy way out to get out of that psychological conundrum that might be disturbing them, an easy way out could be just climate denial. So when we engage in conversations with these people, so how do we talk about it? Of course, then we can't tell people, oh, go find alternate jobs, because those possibilities might not be be there, but probably like, starting from smaller actions where we can tell people to like, change their own behavior on a micro level, that always has spillover effect. So if I'm trying to stay off from meat, that doesn't stay only like, in the domain of meat, then also like, quitting on dairy, doing probably more recycling, buying less, or reusing the stuff that we have. So all of these things, they like, you start with one small action and it translates into a larger set of behavior, and then it spills over into all the other domains, right? So for example, you started with like, micro change in your diet, and then at the end you are also driving less around in your car, or like, you are trying to use public transport more often. So that like, small behavioral change that can actually start a chain reaction, and that can also spill over into many other domains of your life. So in that sense, I think it's important to understand that all of this the eco anxiety, it is real for people, and many times when they are denying, deep down they might know that, well, they're wrong, or they know that they're not on the right side of a spectrum, but there might not be enough alternates available for these people. Also, it's important to state here that in the psychoanalytic model, we have seen that there are multiple ways of talking about the kinds of anxieties people might have. So, for example, Melanie Klein, in her 1887's work, like, from that point onwards, there has been a lot of debate about the two types of anxieties that people might have. One is paranoid schizoid anxiety, and many times this is anxiety that is really related to the constant fear of these climate changes leading to mass scale destructions, which involves feelings of persecution, fear of annihilation, and fragmentation. And it is something that is defended by the psychotic defenses. For example, the absolute denial of reality, that is something that might serve these people better. And also kind of like, projecting onto like, things that might not even be real, but just in order to reduce someone's anxiety, this might be like, the only solution that people might have. The other form of anxiety that was mentioned in like, the psychoanalysis related defense mechanism, that was depressive anxieties. These are the ones that are, instead of this doomsday scenario understanding of the climate change, when people think that it's more related to the loss, to the guilt, or the fear, and like, that like now their natural world is not that dependable as it used to be. And instead of like, feeling extremely neurotic, here people feel much more depressed. So these kinds of defense mechanisms, they have become quite common among people, and we have seen that this is continuing to persist quite a lot. So moving forward, so when it comes to the eco-anxiety that people experience, there are multiple variations in the denial responses and defenses. So as we discussed earlier, there are multiple reasons that people continue to deny the existence of climate change. And one of the biggest reason in that is basically that we as human beings, we have the psychological response through which we continue to deny, or we continue to defend that climate change is not real. But it's not just like, straightforward that either people would really like, become super depressive, that okay, that they believe in it too much, or it's not going to be just the fact that people are going to be outright deniers. deniers. So over this spread or this spectrum, we have seen that research indicates we have basically people who become outright deniers. For example, whenever they are trying to minimize the impact, and it doesn't mean that they are actually not believing in those impacts, but they do believe, but just in order to cope with that anxiety, they find that it's easier to outrightly deny, so that they don't have to engage in any kind of arguments, and they don't have to engage with climate activism, because all of that is emotionally costly as well. The second component is finding scapegoat. So basically, when people tend to say that, well, human action doesn't matter, it's all the large scale companies, or it's just the climate itself, the earth sheds itself once in a while, and that's why all of this is happening. So that, of course, eventually it causes more anxiety when people see that a lot of that starts to happen around them. But again, to begin with, it might be a good defense mechanism for many people. The other component is about the manic defense behavior, where people are basically trying to seek distraction by increasing some substance abuse related behavior, or they are displacing their defense mechanism with something else that might in that consumption or that engagement might prevent some kind of eco anxiety from happening. And we have seen that in many places in the world where there are more calamities happening, people are also not only there is a increase of violence levels, but also there is a higher level of substance abuse that is happening in these areas. Lastly, again, in this spectrum, we know that hopelessness is something that is really prominent, and that usually happens when people think that, well, it's too late already and probably we can't save the world, or there are larger forces and there is no hope left for them. So that's also one of the other extremes. And we have also seen that people tend to become environmentally more destructive, and that's usually to kind of show that they themselves, either they do not believe in climate change, or they just do not care. And I think it's a certain level of apathy that leads to these kinds of defense mechanisms, because otherwise it would be harder for people to engage in these kinds of issues. And then there is a certain kind of intellectualization that we are seeing happening quite often. For example, people going forward and taking courses or trying to learn all the contents, trying to use right language and all of that, but not making an emotional connection, neither with nature nor with any kind of behavioral change. So in a similar way, if people would accumulate a lot of knowledge, but the meaning or the purpose related to that knowledge is not there, or if they do not genuinely mean that they want to make certain changes in their life, in their behavior, then of course it's just intellectualization. It's not going to make any difference to climate change mitigation plans or to anyone else. And also sometimes this can be super cool as a behavior for people to tell others that they know a lot about climate, but that doesn't end up in some kind of positive behavior change, which can serve climate change. There is also idealizing charismatic leaders that support denial. So, and I think for this, we all know that there have been many global leaders around the world where we are seeing that these people have a lot of charisma. I mean, at least they impact some groups or certain kinds of groups. But because of that, it's really kind of creating more defense mechanisms such as repressing or suppressing awareness. And it is, again, an easy way out, because then you don't have to intellectually or emotionally engaged with anything, and it creates again a lot of apathy towards the environment. And also there is a lot of reaction formation, which means that um, people are kind of like using that impulse of denying climate change while simultaneously giving expression to its opposite. For example, those who burn tire on Earth Day, or people who are chanting for, let's say, coal mining, or for deep earth or deep ocean mining, all of that, or talking about all those industries and saying that, well, these industries are running our countries or our communities. So all of these defense mechanisms, ranging from outright denial to hopelessness, all of them, they play a huge role, just because now there is a lot of prevalence of eco-anxiety. So if eco-anxiety is going to exist, this also means that people are actually going to engage with these defense and denial-oriented mechanisms more and more. So how do we work with climate anxiety? There has been recent research which indicates that we need to engage our psychologists, our therapists, our counselors with climate anxiety, with dealing with climate anxiety, because it's a modern new norm. It's happening a lot more. Many of our communities are directly or indirectly dealing with the impacts of climate anxiety. And as I said earlier, there is a whole range of symptoms ranging from the irritability towards climate related changes, all the way to hopelessness and depression. So how do we work with these kind of experiences? So treating climate anxiety, it needs to address the underlying dangers. Otherwise, our people will continue to fall for these defense mechanisms, because if there are no alternatives available, if we are not offering enough support to these people, people are definitely going to fall for these defense mechanisms. Randall's research emphasized the importance of experiencing and articulating difficult emotions into therapy and into engaging with anxiety of people. For example, when people think about loss, about grief, or about fear, and in the shared context should be created, where we need to develop much more mutual support for these people. And in a similar way, it requires a meaningful collective response, including acknowledging the loss of um, um, collective nature, or loss of everything that has been around us in the natural or in the climate context. And we need to do that collectively. We need to do that publicly. For instance, an important step in facing up to the reality of the Anthropocene and the impossibility of continuing the process as normal. Of course, how our climate is and how our world has become, it's not normal, but we can bring these changes. And for that, we need to deal with the anxiety in the clinical practice, in the teaching practices too. We need to talk to the counselors, to the therapists, so that they can help and support the development of such social context that can provide spaces for expression, and that can contain and mobilize climate anxiety into more positive social change. And as I said earlier, it's important to realize that climate anxiety, it's not straightforward, something that should be pathologized, because we need some kind of sensitivity in order to emotionally engage and meaningfully engage with climate mitigation and adaptation, because otherwise the only route is of apathy that we really don't want with climate changes. When we are working with climate anxiety, it is super important that we need to be more aware of climate anxiety, and in particular our mental health professionals. They need to play a much larger role here by allowing the feelings and the thoughts we usually avoid bringing into our awareness. and only in that way we can and will be able to basically avoid more pathological unconscious acting out. And as we just discussed, that there is a huge range of defense mechanisms that are available to humans use. So if you're not going to deal with the anxiety of people, if you're not going to give them spaces for expression, and we need to admit that this is something large scale, this is something prevalent, this is something even hyper prevalent, only then we'll have the capacity to work through these kinds of changes that demand our attention. In the same line of thinking, Bednarik in 2019 formulated this conceptualization, which suggests that climate anxiety should not be seen as a problem to be solved or a condition that needs to be medicated or that needs to be literally eradicated, but rather an important encounter with our awareness of our impact on the world. So really humanizing or thinking about that Anthropocene and thinking about how this Anthropocene can actually also be reversed and leading to better changes for our world and for the climate. So those who are most informed about the current dangers, such as our scientists, our journalists, our students, our activists, they often express more intense fear. And instead of, as I said earlier, pathologizing them, it's important that we see that it has a significance, that we need to speak to these people, we need to provide them spaces for expression, and we need to provide them with tools and with meaning so that they can fight against this anxiety and they can become important drivers of change in our communities and in our society. So when we want to respond to climate anxiety, what needs to be done? So there is a two-pronged approach that needs to be used. First one is that we need to focus, of course, on individual well-being. Of course, as psychologists, individual is our micro unit, and we need to work on that. But also, in order to make a large-scale impact or changes, there needs to be efforts to mitigate climate change in an attempt to promote social well-being. So if we just talk about the therapeutic approaches to the climate anxiety, that is not going to be enough. We also need to talk about or think about mitigating the climate change related adaptation, and also in order to make sure that we excel as a society, as a human race, not just looking at individual anxieties as a problem, but also looking at the potential that it might hold for us. Then individual well-being, in Dodd's research, we have seen that the focus that we need to take for individual well-being or improving individual well-being, for example, coping with the threat to climate change and particularly climate-related anxiety, we can use two approaches, either something that is more commonly known as the problem-focused coping, or the other one, which is more commonly known as the emotion-focused coping. And generally in research, we have seen that whether people engage in problem-focused or the emotion-focused coping, it really depends on the appraisal of the ability to effectively cope with the stressors. But generally, problem-focused coping, it has been given more precedence, because problem-focused coping, it emphasizes on re-evaluating one's ability to make individual behavioral responses or on working to promote societal changes. So we literally focus on what the issue is and then how to engage around that issue, rather than using the approach which is used in the emotion-focused coping, which is really looking at the emotional cognitive engagements of persons and then trying to reframe. So actually we are not changing anything which is in the problem, but actually we're just working with our cognitive frameworks and trying to rethink of the issues in a different way, so that we frame the anxiety, or we de-emphasize the threat in order to reduce people's anxiety. So in that way, I think it's really again, depending on if people are extra vulnerable, probably we can still use emotional focused coping, especially if someone is distressed or they had trauma. Because in cognitive behavioral therapy, we deal with anxiety in such a way that we incorporate this strategy into encouraging individual to reduce the heightened level of assessment of the threat. But when it comes to problem focused coping, the problems are not basically just kind of something that is to think about, but actually going forward and thinking about how to resolve that problem. And again, not all the time people will be able to resolve problem. Let's say if someone had lost their home in Lytton, or someone lost their home that was submerged in Merritt, it's harder for those people to start with thinking about the problem and thinking about the solutions or resolutions. So we really need to assess where someone stands. So if we are people who are being indirectly impacted by climate change, probably thinking about problem-focused coping might be a better alternative. And if people have directly witnessed or gone through something that has provoked a lot of trauma in their life, then probably it's better that those people, they focus on their emotion focused coping. So as psychologists, what can we do in our personal, in our social, or in our community spaces? There are three major interventions that have been suggested throughout the literature that talk about this is what we can offer to our communities. So the first thing is validation. So validation essentially means that when people share their anxiety, when people share their emotion, when people share that they're distressed about the climate or the changes that are happening, it is important that as people who have some knowledge of psychology, we validate their concerns, we validate their emotional responses. And again, we need to also assess that are these issues that can be resolved by focusing on the meaning, on the problem, rather than just focusing on the emotional aspect of that. But depending upon what the background of those people is, and of course in our smaller communities we tend to understand where people are and what they have been facing. So in that sense, we may be able to help them to feel understood, to feel heard. So validation is first step. Doesn't matter if people deny climate change, if people feel distressed, or if people are using any kind of defense mechanism. It's important that the first step from our side is to show open communication, and we can always start that with validation, with a very soft, very open validation. The second intervention that we can usually engage with is literally motivating expression, telling people that as social being, as people who love to connect with others, we want to engage with people in such a way that we connect with them deeply, we allow them to express themselves, and we motivate them to be more connected with the cause, and engaging them and motivating them in working as a powerhouse, as a powerful resource, and also becoming a source of resilience for them. So that interconnection, building the motivation for them or with them to create that meaning and that cause and that purpose. And in addition to that, being that powerful source of resilience for these people through that connectedness or community building together, through activism or through anything else that we can do with people. Also, the last intervention that is essentially one of the most important ones that we have seen in the recent years. It's about ecotherapy. So really looking at the potential that nature has, and tapping into the restorative potential of experience in nature, that is a really important therapeutic response in which people can be engaged on multiple levels, as like, individuals, as groups, as communities. And research has indicated that it has really important, like, positive impact on the well-being of people, but also it can be an important resource for making connections and, like, for coming together as a community, as a small group that can engage in climate-related activism later on. And just extending on that thought, we as humans have a strong interdependence with the natural systems. And that also means that whenever we feel lost, whenever we feel anxious, this might also be one of the biggest powerhouse for our energy, to calm us down, to take away a lot of, like, eco-anxiety. We have seen that research after research now, the people who work in interventions or people who work as clinical practitioners, they argue for and they support that ecotherapeutic approaches, they are the ones that can become a base for providing, like, a social space or an ecological space for providing therapy to people, which can go a long way. So when people are back in nature, they build a mutual trust, and they feel that, like, it's not all doom and gloom, and nature is thriving and it will continue to thrive, and we can actually help it thrive. So like, doing all these therapy related activities outdoors, and providing that restorative experience to people, and working within those natural systems which already exist around us, it can actually, like, enhance our attention, our focus on the greenery, on the positive vibe within the nature, rather than thinking about all that doom and gloom that comes with the eco-anxiety. So in that sense, I think it's super important that we utilize these systems that are available for us, and that too for free. Also, basing on the previous point, it's important that we emphasize that climate change activism, it's also one of the most probably, like, therapeutic thing, because when you are involved in climate change activism, when you are engaged in climate change justice or climate related justice, it's not just, like, coping, but you're also offering yourself for participating in adaptation or pushing forward for the mitigation impact. So again, of course, it requires some effort, it requires some commitment, certain changes in our own lifestyle, but all of that adjusting to a new way of life, it also gives some sense of purpose. It provides people with a lot of autonomy, with a lot of competence, and also relatedness. So for example, people feel empowered when they are given the tools to talk about climate activism, when people know that they are being encouraged to participate, that not only buffers the anxiety that they have about the climate, but also it creates a lot of efficacy, competence in people, which mitigates that threat. And also, like, even if there is a lot of eco-anxiety that might continue to persist, finding that meaning, finding that empowerment, finding that strength, it usually helps people a lot, and it also in the long run helps our environment and our climate. And also research by Ojala and Clayton has found that when people are participating in climate activism, that actually makes their well-being much better. People have reported higher levels of happiness, and because they have some purpose, some meaning, and they are engaged, and they find that they are more empowered, it also mitigates their climate anxiety. So one, like, in addition to doing all the interventions that we just talked about, for example, simply validating people or motivating them to express themselves, or participating in ecotherapy, engaging engaging with nature, I think climate activism is probably one of the best way to cope with anxiety. So instead of worrying about the problem, becoming a part of the solution, thinking about solution, vouching for or voicing for that climate adaptation and mitigation, that can have a huge impact on our own lives and also the lives of the future generations. And especially if we live in a place and in a country and in a community where we have all the freedom to talk about the issues that concern us or that are important to us, I think it's really important that we take advantage of participating in that climate activism by adjusting to a relatively different way of life, and especially being more empowered, happier, focusing on our own well-being instead of eco-anxiety. That can be a win-win for us, for the future generations, and also for our planet. So to conclude, when we think about climate change, it's not a one level or one scale problem. We need to think of it something that is on individual level, not only important, but something that has capacity or the empowerment for the individual to make changes, to reduce this climate anxiety and to kind of motivate us for climate adaptation. So of course it is really important that psychologists understand that we need to be more involved in addressing implication of climate change on individual level. When people are anxious, they are anxious. So how to provide them with empowerment tools rather than letting them think about these issues on their own and falling for different types of defense mechanisms. So on a psychological level, it is a time to think seriously, more seriously, about the ways in which climate change is impairing people's mental health, and how as psychologists we can take them out of those stresses or those issues. The second conclusion that we can draw from this learning is that eco-anxiety and ecological problems, they are social. So it's not that straightforward, and we can't just say that we can provide counseling or psychotherapy to individual and we are done with eco-anxiety, because eco-anxiety it's something that characterizes people's responses to climate change. It is structured by in a way that our society is addressing or it is not addressing the problem. So particularly when we think about individual mental health, that is genuinely based in the kind of social networks we have and the kind of social comparisons that we focus on. So in order to make sure that our individuals are more engaged, we need to build social relations and community networks that are focused more on the problem-based coping or towards the solutions, rather than just thinking about who has more money, who is more prestigious, and how to bigger houses, bigger infrastructures, and become more richer communities or countries. So as it's not just an individual problem, it's a large-scale social problem. Lastly, when we think about the solutions to eco-anxiety or the anxiety that is embedded or an outcome of climate changes, it is important to think that it is an outcome that is multilateral, and it is a real problem, right? So by multilateral, we mean that there are multiple scales of origination of this anxiety. So if people are not able to find proper ways to mitigate or cope, so it's not just onto those individuals, and nor it's onto some communities and some structures, but it's also generally how our systems, our communities, and our nations and the global nations are set up, how competitive these things have become, and everyone is racing for better per capita income for their people. So in all of that, I think on multiple levels, multiple scales, it is important to mitigate or try to mitigate the impacts of these changes. And I think in recent days, COP26 has been a very important reminder to us that if we win, we will all win, and if we lose, we will all lose. So in that sense, it's important to think about, like, how our nations work, how the globe work, how our societies work, and how we are all interconnected and we are one or none, right? So it's important that we think of these ecological problems and the linked eco-anxieties on the same multiscalar way, the way we think about, like, the global conflicts and many other things. So to conclude, I think the take-home message from this discussion is that we need to work together, and we need to work against eco-anxiety in a way that our communities are more resilient, and in a way that we provide more empowerment tools to our youth, to people who are engaged in research work or in advocacy for climate change. So in that sense, I think we need to develop more practical tools, approaches, and things so that we can provide appropriate support for that. And the answer, of course, then it lies only in the fact that, of course, sometimes we will have to work with individual therapy for people depending upon their context, depending upon their trauma and experience. But most of the time, we also need to develop stronger networks that are based on supportive relationships, that are based on providing empowerment to each other, and relationships that are about living in the natural world and living in the natural ways and living within the natural means, and hence, like, building that community, building that activism is very important, and that's like, at the core of building resilience for eco-anxiety, just the way we have done with the COVID-19, that we see what are the impacts and how they are translating into different types of anxieties, and how we mitigated much of it by, let's say, developing a vaccine, and by developing global cooperation in the world. In the same way, we need to cooperate with each other, with the natural world, so that nature itself can function as one of the communal spaces for us, where we can thrive, where nature can thrive, and where we can live as happy and healthy community as we are supposed to. Yeah. So with that, I'll leave you with this idea that think about your communities, think about all the powerful work that you can do, and always capitalize on individual behavior. They have a lot of power, and that create a lot more resilience, empowerment, and autonomy in you. And together, I think we can contribute to mitigating and adapting for climate change, and together we can work against eco-anxiety. And with that, thank you so much.